Welcome, brave souls, to a journey into the most chilling corners of morgues and graveyards, where the dead don't always rest in peace. Tonight, we uncover 5 terrifying true stories of eerie encounters, ghostly whispers, and unexplainable horrors lurking among the tombstones and cold storage rooms. From morgue workers who witnessed the impossible to graveyards hiding sinister secrets, these tales will make you think twice before stepping foot near the dead of night. Turn off the lights, grab a blanket, and get ready to be haunted. If you dare, let's begin. Hi, my name is James Thomas, and the experience I'm going to share with you occurred about 2 years ago. However, before I share my experience with you and all of the channel's friends, I must share a story I heard that became somewhat of a legend. However, it's not exactly a legend because it actually happened a few years ago at the morgue where I used to work. It was an incident that left a lasting impression on that location at the time, which was even smaller than it is today, and a medical examiner was employed there, and he primarily worked at night. Everyone thought he was a nice guy when he was out on the streets, but few knew that he had a disorder and that when he was by himself, he liked to have intimate relations with the cadavers. He would do this at night with all of them, regardless of how long they had been dead or how recently they had passed away. They claimed that he did this for many years, but eventually the truth came out, and he was fired for obvious reasons. After that, he was unable to find work in any comparable position, not even in his own line of work. For a few months, everything fell silent and seemed to be resolved, but it was only a matter of time until rumors began to circulate in the surrounding areas. Some claimed that the security personnel or even the morgue staff would allow him entry at night, while others claimed that the staff would not allow him entry at all, and that he would enter however he could because he was familiar with the building and would do so to sate his repulsive cravings. The medical examiner was eventually chased away several times as a result of these rumors, and one night, people discovered his lifeless body in the rooms where the corpses were kept. His body was lying on the floor in a very unsettling and frightening manner because it wasn't in a normal position, and all of his bones were broken and misaligned, as if he had been bent in many different directions by a grinding machine or perhaps something with a lot of force. When they moved his body, they claimed to hear his bones crackling. News of the examiner's passing spread, and a lot of legends about him emerged, especially since the morgue had closed a few months after his death. My experience started when I started working there, and the legend was already circulating when they told me that the examiner's spirit could be seen wandering the corridors at night, especially where the bodies were kept. At first, the story clearly frightened me, but after a few night shifts during which nothing happened, my fear started to fade. It turns out, though, that the more seasoned employees, I'm not talking about a few years, I mean people who have worked there for over 10 years, always advised me to carry a flashlight. In fact, there were multiple flashlights stored in one location at the end of the main hallway. That is, as you would enter the corridor that leads to the offices and other rooms, you would see a desk with multiple flashlights, all of which had batteries already in them. Like any conscientious employee, I always carried my flashlight. However, as the months passed, I began to believe it was useless because the morgue had a good electrical system. Even during extremely powerful storms, which I had already experienced there, the electricity never failed. Jack, an elderly security guard who was about 70 years old, was instructed to turn on the backup generator that was located nearby, which would supply power to the entire building. The morgue also had emergency lights that were powered by that gas-powered generator, so at least it was possible to walk through the building one stormy night when I was the only one working late until I was almost finished with my shift. Approximately 11 p.m. Not even that late when the building's power abruptly went out. I called Jack and asked him to turn on the generator. At first, he didn't answer, indicating that he wasn't on the same floor as me. To make things worse, I couldn't remember where I had left my cell phone. I usually kept it on the desk or in the pocket of my coat, which I would hang next to the door, so it could have been in multiple locations in the complete darkness. Since it was impossible to pinpoint its location in that complete darkness, I opted to sit there and wait for a few minutes. I had been working at the morgue for about a year by the time my night terror started, so I walked those corridors every day despite my overwhelming fear and anxiety. At first, I heard something approaching, but it wasn't footsteps or any movement from a person I would recognize. Instead, it was a cracking sound like something was breaking, and it kept getting closer and closer to where I was. As it got closer, I began to recognize those strange noises, which sounded like bones cracking slowly but surely moving in my direction, that I calmly thought that perhaps if I remembered the steps I would take to leave the room and head down the hallway, I could make it to where the flashlights were or even out of the building. Since it seemed better than staying put, I started to walk, but that thing followed me. Bones were cracking behind me, but not in the usual way. I could also hear something dragging itself. Suddenly, the cracking sounds approached me more quickly than I could move, and I could hear them almost at my heels. Whatever was making those noises was dragging itself only a few inches from me. As planned, I continued to walk while perspiring and feeling like my heart was about to explode. When I finally arrived at the desk with the flashlights, I quickly grabbed one and turned it on, praying to God that whatever was behind me would vanish. When I turned around, I heard those demonic bone-cracking noises that had followed me all the way to that desk. I turned on the flashlight and spun around, but nothing was behind me. As soon as I rushed out of the building, I saw Jack, and we turned on the emergency lights, which were powered by a gas generator. We then waited for the building's main power to return. After the electricity was restored, which was about 3 or 4 hours later, I finally found the courage to return to get my phone and other belongings. By that time, my shift was over, and I went home to rest. Interestingly, after that night, I began to reflect more on what had happened and piece together a few things. One was that, as night fell and the sun went down, all of the lights in the entire morgue were turned on, and we were not permitted to turn off any of them. It didn't matter if an office, a room, or a storage area wasn't in use. Every single light, without exception, had to stay on, lighting every corner of that building. They say it is believed that the examiner used to satiate his perverse fantasies with the corpses in complete darkness, which is why he only appears when the lights go out. This is just a belief, but one that I firmly support based on my experience that the examiner does continue to appear, but only when the building is in darkness. I hope my story was enjoyable to you. I hope everyone has a great evening and extend my greetings to all of the subscribers and listeners of this fantastic channel. Story number 2. Blessings to everyone who watches this channel. Because of the cemetery's close proximity to my house, I had a direct view of it from my window and could easily observe everything that happened there. As a result, I generally avoided looking too much in that direction. A recent story shared here reminded me of an old experience I witnessed when I lived in a house next to a cemetery. My name is Martin and I'm from Manhattan. I lived in that house for a long time and never saw anything. But one night I noticed something really odd. A winged creature landed on one of the headstones after descending from the sky. Its large dark wings and striking silhouette against the moonlight led me to believe it was some kind of nocturnal predator because it remained motionless for extended periods of time, seemingly watching over the area or waiting for something. It struck me as strange that only eyes seemed to notice this creature's repeated visits to the cemetery at the same time and location. It felt like the creature was revealing itself to me alone, and my neighbors never went outside at that hour. They didn't see anything strange, but I couldn't take my eyes off the window. Its movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as if it were performing some sort of ceremony, and I couldn't understand why it was there night after night, silently observing the creature go about its daily business, until I started to lose track of time. It seemed to be there for a reason, and its presence indicated that something negative was happening without anyone else knowing. Days turned into nights, and my thoughts centered on the cemetery. The creature never looked directly at me, but it seemed to be aware that I was watching it. Its seeming indifference only made me feel more uneasy, and one night it disappeared. The next night it appeared again, quieter than before, with slow, almost ceremonial movements, and I felt both relieved and frustrated. The cemetery that had once been a place of eternal rest now felt like a place of unsettling activity, and every step and flap of its wings felt like a choreographed dance. The atmosphere became almost intolerable. There was a sense of lurking in the air as the Creator's presence disturbed the tranquility. Mums and menace headstones became witnesses to whatever was going on. The nights appeared to go on forever, and the only sound to break the stillness was the occasional flap of its wings. Night after night, they carried out their mysterious activities, the purpose of which I could not yet understand. There was no obvious pattern in their movements, but the repeated actions suggested a clearly defined goal. Their sharp talons reflected the moonlight and exuded a disturbing aura. Every night, the air got heavier, and I started to notice changes in my surroundings. My garden plants mysteriously withered, and animals avoided my house. It appeared that the creature's presence had an impact on everything around me, extending beyond the cemetery. This led me to believe that the creature had a detrimental effect on the immediate environment, and my health began to suffer as a result of my restless nights. They performed their mysterious activities, the purpose of which I could not yet determine. There was no obvious pattern in their movements, but the repeated actions suggested a well-defined objective. Their sharp talons reflected the moonlight and emanated a disconcerting aura night after night. I started to notice changes around me as the air got heavier every night. It appeared that the creature's presence affected everything around me, extending its influence beyond the cemetery. I believed the creature had a negative impact on the immediate environment because my garden plants withered mysteriously and animals avoided approaching my house. My health began to suffer as a result of my restless nights. I was physically exhausted from the lack of sleep and the ongoing stress, but I couldn't stop watching because it had a hypnotic quality. One night, as the creature went about its daily business, I couldn't take my eyes off the window because of something that made a deep, resounding sound that could be heard even from my window. It sounded like a profound lament. For a brief moment, the creature seemed to be responding to the call, and the silhouettes surrounding it shifted, causing a frightful and chaotic scene. The sky grew even darker, and a chilly chill entered my room. As if they were consuming the energy of my house, I sensed an unseen presence watching from the shadows. The creature and the other silhouette appeared to grow stronger every night. I never learned why they disappeared. The cemetery returned to its normal appearance by day, but the sense that something sinister was going on persisted. Eventually, I stopped gazing out the window, and the tension of those nights was etched into my memory. Before dawn, there was only the memory of a presence that defied reason and logic. And the cemetery continued to be a place of mystery and terror. The winged creature and its companions went about their daily lives, hidden from most people's view but always lingering in my memory like a permanent reminder. My life resumed its seemingly normal routine, but for me, the cemetery will always be a place where the inexplicable left its mark. I came to the conclusion that there are things we will never fully understand. I promised that I never talked about what I saw because people would assume I was lying or going insane. The nights eventually returned to being peaceful, but I always got a shiver whenever I went by the cemetery because I remembered those nights and the creature watching me from atop the tombs. This occurred in the 1990s when cameras weren't as advanced as they are now. I even attempted to take some pictures at the time, but due to the distance and lack of light, nothing turned out. I can assure you that my story is completely true, and I sincerely appreciate you listening. The Loyal Dog. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to share a story about my experience working in a cemetery in my hometown. My duties included ensuring that the graves were tidy and well-maintained, which involved mowing the grass, disposing of litter, and ensuring everything was orderly. One day, a family requested that I take special care of a specific grave, which appeared simple and somewhat overlooked. They shared that both a man and his dog were buried there together, and strangely, every year on Memorial Day, I would see a dog resting on that very grave. Initially, I thought it was merely a coincidence, but it occurred consistently every year without exception. It was the same dog, characterized by its dark fur and mournful eyes. Although I only encountered the dog once a year, its annual appearance left a significant impression on me over time. I began to look forward to it, almost as though it had become a personal tradition, ensuring that the grave was neat before its arrival. This annual occurrence turned into a date I marked on my calendar. Perhaps it was because I spent considerable time in that area and had developed a certain connection to that grave. I sensed that the dog had a reason for its visits, yet I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Its sorrow resonated deeply within me. One year, a sudden cold front swept through on Memorial Day, and the wind began to rustle among the gravestones. I sensed a presence nearby, so I glanced around, but the only figure I saw was that dog lying in its usual spot. I thought it might be there to continue watching over its owner even after passing, but I only ever saw it once a year, and despite my efforts to acclimate to its presence, that singular annual visit had a profound impact on me. The sight of that dog consistently filled me with a profound sense of emptiness, mirroring a lingering sadness. Over time, I grew to accept the expectation of seeing that dog each year. Its presence reminded me that some bonds are eternal. That burial site and the dog, where the inexplicable converged and sorrow persisted, remained enigmatic to me. The dog was central to it all. Each time I spotted it, I felt both sadness and reverence for that connection that exceeded time itself. I kept this experience to myself, but Memorial Day evenings were particularly challenging as the dog's presence amplified the cemetery's weight of grief and desolation, saturating the atmosphere with memories and feelings I couldn't dismiss. Even to this day, I honor the dog's yearly visits, but I safeguard its watch as a private, solemn tribute. Wrong shortcut. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I want to recount my experience. I should point out that prior to this event, I was a skeptic regarding the paranormal. I viewed it solely as entertainment. However, one fateful night in a cemetery changed my perspective completely, providing me with a terrifying encounter that makes my heart race whenever I think back on it. I'm writing to you from Ohio, where I lived at that time. One night, after leaving work late, I opted for a shortcut that would lead me home more quickly, which meant passing through a cemetery. It's worth noting that this cemetery was very old. Even though it didn't appear entirely abandoned, I occasionally saw individuals engaged in maintenance work. Despite the gloomy appearance of the weathered gravestones, my skepticism allowed me to walk through the cemetery without much worry. The pale moonlight created shadows on the tombstones and mausoleums, amplifying their haunting charm. Yet I continued on my path. About halfway through, I heard a murmur behind me, a sort of agonizing moan. I looked back but saw nothing, even as my sense of unease intensified. Eventually, I noticed a figure in the distance. It resembled a man dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by a similarly worn hat. He stood beside a grave that had obviously been neglected for many years. In the dim light, I could see he was clutching a rusty shovel. Upon seeing him, I froze for a moment, then managed to ask, "Sir, are you all right? Do you require assistance?" However, he did not respond. A heavy silence enveloped the area, as if the cemetery itself were muffling the sounds of the nearby city. After a few moments, he slowly raised his head, revealing a ghostly face lacking color, with two hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. The most frightening part came next. In a deep, echoing, dreadful voice, he stated, "You shouldn't be here." My heart raced wildly, pounding so forcefully I thought it might explode from my chest. I attempted to run, but it felt as though my legs were anchored to the ground. Then something occurred that I swear was not a figment of my imagination. I distinctly felt a chilling hand clutching my right ankle, holding me in place. I fought with all my strength, finally breaking free, and I began to sprint desperately in search of an exit, as if I were being pursued by wails and screams. I could also feel the piercing stares of spectral entities lurking among the graves. It was as if I no longer inhabited a cemetery, but was instead in a nightmarish alternate dimension. Eventually, I managed to flee, and suddenly everything returned to normal. That night, I learned that certain places are best left undisturbed, and cemeteries are definitely among them. I'm convinced these locations harbor countless secrets that are best left untouched. They've left an unforgettable impression on me. I'll conclude my tale here with a word of caution. If you wish to avoid experiencing something similar, steer clear of specific shortcuts, particularly when they involve traversing a cemetery at night. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful evening.